Bueno, la verdad es que impresiona esta cabecera, pasar del DEFCON 5 al DEFCON 1 y te avisen de una guerra nuclear inminente, la verdad es que impresiona. En todo caso, muy buenas tardes, noches desde España, a todos los países de habla hispana y especialmente a nuestro invitado de lujo y de honor en Reino Unido, porque estos días presenta, como todos sabéis, este libro que Ken Follett, Nunca, su última novela, en la que vuelve a los orígenes después de tanto tiempo escribiendo sobre la Edad Media con su mítica trilogía que empezó en Los Pilares de la Tierra y vuelve un poco a los orígenes y con él vamos a hablar de esto en los próximos minutos y con muchos de los lectores que hay esparcidos por todo el mundo, vuelve al origen de una trama de espionaje, de relaciones internacionales, de un mundo bélico. Ken Follett, desde España, muy buenas tardes. ¿Qué te ha llevado a volver a esos temas actuales del espionaje, de escenarios bélicos? ¿Tan peligroso ves el mundo que decides hablar sobre eso para tratar de espantar esos miedos? Muy buenas noches.
I wrote this because I just thought it was a great story. And, you know, that's always the reason why I write a book. I think it's a great story. That's the main thing I think about. I don't think about genres. Should I write a historical novel? Should I write a thriller? I just think if I think in my guts, this could be a really great story, then that's the story that I write.
Enseguida hablamos de eso, de cómo lo has visto desde el interior y cómo has ido trazando las historias paralelas que se entrecruzan en esta maravillosa historia que es Nunca. Pero antes saludamos ya a Nuria Cabutí, que es consejera delegada de Penguin Random House. Yo no soy muy bueno pronunciando inglés, lo hago con acento gallego. Vamos a decir que Penguin para los amigos. Nuria, adelante. Buenas noches.
Hola, buenas tardes y buenas tardes a todos los lectores por conectarse a este acto de presentación de Nunca, la nueva novela de Ken Follett, un libro que siempre esperamos y que nos gusta tener en nuestras librerías, en nuestras estanterías. Hi Ken, it's a real pleasure to have you here and my best greetings from Barcelona. Y Xabier también, hola desde aquí, encantada de que podamos pues, compartir este rato con todos vosotros, ¿no? Bueno, para nosotros la publicación de Ken Follett es siempre un gran acontecimiento editorial. Publicamos a Follett en todos los países de habla hispana y realmente son libros siempre muy esperados por los libreros, por los lectores. Y en esta ocasión, Ken nos ha sorprendido con un gran cambio de registro, con un thriller de alto voltaje que seducirá a todos los que se acerquen desde la primera página. Porque además, aparte de ser un gran thriller, yo creo que también es un libro de advertencia, ¿no? De lo que podría realmente pasar a través de un retrato excepcional y escalofriante de lo fácil que sería de que realmente hubiera una tercera guerra mundial. ¿Podrían los líderes de los países más importantes del mundo frenar esa escalada? Bueno, yo creo que esto hay muchas aventuras, historias, relatos muy interesantes en este libro. Este libro acaba de salir en todo el mundo, en muchísimos idiomas y en nuestro caso concreto con muchísima ilusión y por supuesto que será el gran thriller internacional de estas Navidades. Así que está pues, acompañado de una gran campaña de promoción y marketing y vamos a dar acompañamiento durante estos meses próximos a este gran libro que estamos seguros que vamos a reimprimir muy próximamente. Así que, Ken, muchísimas gracias por la confianza, felicidades por este nuevo libro. Y aquí mi pregunta, yo sé que te van a preguntar mucho sobre el contenido del libro, pero yo lo que te quiero preguntar es, ahora que estás haciendo tu promoción desde casa y que está siendo, lo sé, muy, muy efectiva, pero ¿qué echas de menos de tus antiguas promociones y tours mundiales, ¿no? ¿Qué hacías?
Well, there's good and bad, of course, and the bad thing is that I don't get to be in the same room as the people who read and love my books, and after all, that's important because they are the people who pay the rent, as we say. On the other hand, it really is quite nice not to have to spend so much time in airports and hotels, so there's an upside to it as well. But I guess we don't really have a choice. We do things this way now because this is the way of today, and we make the best of it. And I actually you know, I've had some very interesting conversations with readers over the last couple of weeks, talking about the book and answering their questions on Zoom and all the other programs that enable us to talk to one another all around the world. So I guess I feel I'm still in touch with my readers.
Que te echamos mucho de menos, que esperamos verte pronto por alguno de nuestros países, sea en América Latina o en España, y mientras tanto pues desearte muchísimo éxito y te envío un abrazo muy fuerte y espero pues que estemos siempre en contacto. Hasta pronto.
Thank you.
Bueno, hablar con alguien como Ken Follett, que ha vendido o lleva vendidos 180 millones de libros en todo el mundo, impone, pero vamos a intentarlo. Primero decir que no estoy en ningún centro de mando de lanzadores de misiles, ni en ningún búnker nuclear. Estos monitores que ven aquí no significan que vayamos a mandar misiles, sino a conversar. Es un centro de televisión española y quiero dejarlo claro porque ahora que estoy viendo el reflejo parece que estuviéramos metidos en la propia novela de Ken Follett. Estamos, Ken, asistiendo a un mundo que se está armando y rearmando, pero no ya solo con las armas convencionales, sino con todo tipo de misiles hipersónicos, balísticos, nucleares. Hay una capacidad brutal de destruir la Tierra varias miles de veces. A mí como una me llega, pero varias veces de miles podemos destruir la Tierra. Es esta nueva Guerra Fría, algo más caliente que la de los 60, 70 o por lo menos más peligrosa.
This Cold War is much more dangerous, I think. You know, in the 60s, after the Cuban Missile Crisis, we felt that we got to know the Russians and we could negotiate with them. And we didn't think they would do anything unexpected. And they felt the same about us. And although it was still a dangerous situation, it seemed to be getting safer. In the 80s and 90s, we got rid of a lot of nuclear weapons. There were fewer weapons in the world. And then it all went wrong. And now there are more weapons. There are more countries that have weapons. And most dangerous of all, the Russians aren't our enemy so much now. It's the Chinese that we're worried about. And this is new. And anything new is destabilizing. We're not used to the Chinese. We don't know about the Chinese government. We don't know how they work. We don't know what they want. And when you're dealing with somebody who you can't predict, it's just all the more dangerous. So I really think right now, the danger of nuclear war is greater than it has ever been throughout my life.
Antes decías, era todo muy peligroso, pero por lo menos había un teléfono que conectaba, un teléfono rojo, según nos han contado, y que conectaba los dos grandes centros de poderes nucleares, como era Moscú y Washington. Ahora aparece Pekín. Y dices que esto incluye una variante que desconocemos porque no sabemos muy bien los mecanismos por los que se mueve, en este caso, la dictadura china. ¿A ti es esto lo que más te preocupa de estos momentos?
Yes. Yes, this is very worrying. The Chinese government has been offered what was called a hotline, the red phone that would go from the White House directly to Zhongnanhai, which is where the Chinese president is. And they said no, they don't want a hotline. Why would they say that? Surely they want to stop a war the same as we do. Why do they not want to have this phone? That's just one example of how we can't understand them. We don't know why they do what they do. And that puts us in a dangerous situation. You know, that hotline was installed because sometimes the people who are watching see what they think are missiles and it turns out to be a flock of geese flying. And that's happened. That's happened a couple of times. And we've come close to an unnecessary nuclear war. So that was why the hotline was installed, so that we can phone them and say, "Are you really sending these missiles?" And we don't have that we don't have that ability with the Chinese. So we're in a more dangerous situation. And it's just another example of how we don't really understand them.
China será difícil de entender, pero Corea del Norte aún debe ser mucho más complicado. Lo metes en la variable de este mundo tripolar de una potencia de la que se desconoce mucho más que la de China, con unos dirigentes mucho más herméticos que los de China, pero con una capacidad de cabreo, de enfado mucho mayor y también con material, en principio se parece, nuclear. La variante norcoreana, sus relaciones con Corea del Sur, que también afloran en la novela, son otro ingrediente más que, en este caso, introduce más imprevisibilidad a todo lo que puede pasar.
Yes, I agree completely. And I have to tell you that this makes the story in my novel more interesting because the Chinese and the North Koreans are allies, of course, but they don't always agree. Really, for China, North Korea is like a teenage son. You know, when you have, or daughter, when you have a teenage son or daughter, of course you love them, but sometimes they do things you don't want them to do. And sometimes you get mad at them. You still love them. And it's like that with China and Korea. China and Korea are allies and they're inseparable. But sometimes Korea does things that really annoy the Chinese. And that's all part in Never. That relationship is part of the instability of the world situation. And it contributes to the escalation of the crisis.
Usted es un europeísta convencido y lo ha demostrado en cuanto a Europa como centro con sus problemas y luces y sombras, pero difusor de ideas de democracia y de libertad. Cuando asistimos a un rearme generalizado, a un mundo, como decía antes, no bipolar, sino multipolar, ¿qué papel puede jugar para acabar con esta locura Europa, que no tiene, digamos, salvo las que tiene Reino Unido y Francia, pero en principio no son regímenes tan imprevisibles como el chino o el coreano? ¿Qué puede hacer Europa en esta disputa nuclear?
Well, the thing about Europe is one of the three great economic powers of the world, but it's not a great military power. And so in my story, in Never, Europe does not play a big role because it's not a big military power. And we may ask, well, should we be a big military power? And my feeling is the Europeans are pretty smart to be rich, but not have a huge army, because that means that you probably don't need to be involved in the next world war. And I kind of have a sneaking suspicion that the Europeans are being really smart about this.
África. Usted en la novela, no vamos desde luego a desentrañarla ni avanzar nada, pero hay varios elementos que se juegan. Estamos hablando de Corea, de China, de Washington, pero también de África. En África usted mete unos elementos, introduce unos elementos humanos, introduce la inmigración, la huida del horror y del hambre y también el cambio climático. En toda esta ecuación que estamos analizando, el cambio climático, la desesperación de millones de personas que escaparán del hambre y de la miseria y de la guerra, ¿qué papel juega en la construcción de su novela y del mundo actual?
Well, the spark that begins the crisis in Never is the killing of an American soldier by a jihadi using a Chinese rifle. And as we know, Americans get very angry, even if just one American is killed. And so the American government feels that it must respond to this killing. Now, that's like the killing that started World War I. It was the assassination of the nephew of the emperor. And not a very important event in itself, but it was the spark that lit the fuse. Now, the other thing about North Africa is because of climate change, the desert is getting bigger. And there's an oasis in the Sahara Desert called Lake Chad, which used to be 10,000 square miles, and now it's only 500 square miles because of climate change. And so the people who used to live around that lake, are either dying or trying to go somewhere else, and many of them try to go to Europe. And I think it's a very vivid symbol of what's happening in the world today, that Kia, who is a young Arab woman in the story, makes a journey from Lake Chad all the way to Europe. And her journey is driven by climate change. And she ends up in the place where we are causing climate change. Climate change is what we're doing, isn't it? We're burning coal, we're burning oil, we fill our cars with petrol. That's what causes climate change. And yet we don't like migration. We hate illegal migration into our countries. And yet we're causing it. And I thought Kia's journey from Lake Chad to Europe is such a symbol of the connection between what we do in our lives, in our everyday lives, and the problems that drive migrants to try to come to Europe.
Habla de la Primera Guerra Mundial, del atentado de Sarajevo, casi como un efecto mariposa que provoca una guerra que, pasados los años, ni los propios países que están en la guerra saben por qué están luchando, Algo ha empezado. Usted dice, empieza la novela con este episodio de unos americanos que son matados en África y provoca una segunda reacción, que es el embargo de armas a Corea del Norte, y todo se va desencadenando a continuación. Pero en el medio de toda esa crisis, de la que luego hablamos, hay personajes que en las historias paralelas son capaces de enamorarse. A mí me recuerda un poco aquella escena de Casablanca, cuando Ingrid Bergman, antes de la toma de París por los nazis, le dice a Humphrey Bogart: el mundo se desmorona y nosotros nos enamoramos. ¿Es posible el factor humano en situaciones tan tensas como la que usted describe? Incluso afectan a la presidenta de Estados Unidos.
Oh, absolutely. And, it's a fact of human nature that no matter what else is happening, human beings can fall in love. In the worst circumstances, in the middle of the war, in the middle of being bombed, human beings get together and they fall in love. It's a very, very strong drive. There's also a literary reason for this. In all of my novels, in all popular novels, the reader is invited to share the emotions of the people in the story. And that's what we love about novels. It's what I love when I'm reading a novel. I like to feel angry or sad or scared about what's happening in the novel. And that's what I try to give my readers, because that's what we really love about novels. And if you're going to do that, if you're going to worry about what's worrying Pauline or Chiang Kai in China or Abdul and Kia in the Sahara Desert, if you're going to worry about them, you have to know them as people, not just characters, not just pawns, not just pieces in a chess game. They have to be people. They have to have a life outside the story, which means there must be people they love and people that love them. There must be problems that are ordinary problems that you and I might have, and we have had in our lives. That is what bonds the reader to the characters in the story. So you can't write a story in which the characters just drive the story forward. They have to have something else. They have to be rounded human beings. That's why my American president has a teenage daughter and a husband who doesn't seem to love her very much. And that's why that's why Chiang Kai in Beijing has a very important job in the Chinese Secret Service. He also has a wife he adores. He's madly in love with his wife. These are things that make the characters in the book human, and it's very important. And I think it's realistic too.
Es un retorno a... Hablaba usted hace un momento del factor humano, de cómo influye el factor humano en todas las relaciones, incluso en decisiones de las grandes potencias. Eso me recuerda un poco, hablando del factor relacionado con el espionaje, que nos remite un poco a su primera gran novela, aquí traducida en español como La isla de las tormentas, y y en inglés creo que originalmente El ojo de la aguja, donde pues un espía se acaba fatalmente enamorando de una mujer. Aquí, en esta novela, el espionaje tiene mucho que jugar. El espionaje fundamentalmente en China, pero también en África. Y ahí hay también celos, odios internos. Eso es tan así. El factor humano tiene que ver también con decisiones de los equipos de espionaje que pueden afectar a una crisis internacional.
Well, I'm sure it's possible. I don't think it's a very good way to write a story. We don't want to read a story about a nuclear war that was caused because somebody was upset about what their wife or husband had done, because that would that wouldn't be convincing. So it's not really, in real life, I do believe this happens. In a novel, it's not a very good move. Because it suggests to the reader that what is going on in the world situation isn't that important. So I guess I probably wouldn't do that in a novel, even though I think you're probably right and it does happen in real life. A novel has to be more real than life.
Los populismos, en todo este mundo geopolítico, surgen los populismos desde hace unos cuantos años. En Estados Unidos lo hemos visto con Trump, en Brasil con Bolsonaro, en Europa también los hay, en España, donde estamos, también los hay. Esto del populismo es el elemento desestabilizador que faltaba para la tormenta perfecta.
Well, the president of the United States is, to some extent, influenced. She's under pressure from a populist rival, James Moore, who is running against her in the primaries. And of course, he isn't on his own. He represents a strand of public opinion. And national leaders are always under pressure from public opinion. This is even true in places that are undemocratic, such as China and the Soviet Union. There is a certain amount of public pressure on the leaders. So the populist strain in American politics is represented by James Moore, who is not the president, but he hopes to be president, and Pauline has to react to him all the time. So I think that strain is present. I didn't want this to be a story about a war begun by a crazy man, because that's not a good story. It could happen, unfortunately. It may happen in real life, but it's not a good story because it's too quick, it's too easy. So that strain, the populists don't cause the crisis. They contribute to it, but they're on the sidelines.
Desde luego, Nunca, la novela es absolutamente impredecible. Dos cuestiones para concluir por mi parte antes de dar paso a lectores por todo el mundo de habla hispana que quieren hacerle formular una pregunta. Primero, hay varias tramas en la novela que casi como del DEFCON 5 al DEFCON 1 van subiendo en escala, incluso en lo emocional, en lo personal, en lo político y en lo bélico. Antes de escribir la novela, ¿tenías claro cuál iba a ser la escalada progresiva hasta el final? ¿O cuando vas escribiendo se te van ocurriendo, vamos a subir aquí, vamos a bajar allá?
Oh, no, I plan all these things very carefully. I spend a long time planning. And I write the plan and I write it again and again and again, all the time trying to improve it, trying to make it more logical, more fast moving. I couldn't do a story like Never if I didn't plan it. Now, I know that some of my friends and colleagues who are also novelists write that way. Lee Child is a friend of mine, and he types chapter 1, and then he says, what shall I do next? And I couldn't work that way. But it doesn't work for me. It works for some writers. So I'm a very careful planner. That's the only way I can keep track of the complexities in my stories.
La única vez que se me ocurrió escribir algo, empecé escribiendo una historia y acabé con otra historia absolutamente distinta y no decidí publicarla. Por lo tanto, entiendo perfectamente que para novelas tan amplias como la suya haya que tener muy claro antes de sentarse al teclado lo que hay que decir. Para concluir por mi parte, ¿se le ha ocurrido a usted, Ken Follett, o a la editorial, enviar un ejemplar en ruso al Kremlin, un ejemplar a la Casa Blanca, a Trump, a Putin, a Kim Jong-un, firmado por usted, a los grandes líderes que tienen armas nucleares? ¿Sería bueno que leyeran esta novela, Nunca, para que sepan que cosas así son posibles?
I would be thrilled if the world leaders read this novel, and it would be a great publicity stunt to send them all a copy of Never, although they probably wouldn't have time to read it. Actually, this book is not going to be published in China. All my other books have been published in China in Mandarin, the main language of China. But my Chinese publishers have told me that they don't think this book can be published in China. So maybe we should send a copy to Xi Jinping.
Bueno, pues yo se lo dejo ahí, tanto a Penguin como a Ken Follett, como a la editorial, simplemente como idea para mandárselo allí donde hay arsenales nucleares, que lean Nunca. Es muy recomendable. Vamos a empezar ahora a dialogar, al diálogo con lectores de toda la vida de Ken Follett en algunos de los países de habla hispana. Vamos a empezar este recorrido con Santiago Díaz en Colombia, que ya nos debe estar escuchando. Mientras vemos a Ken Follett apurar, según me ha dicho, un vino Red Wine Spanish, o como se diga, vino tinto español. Es muy recomendable y saludable. Vamos a conectar con Colombia, con Santiago Díaz. No sé si nos está ya escuchando. ¿Te escucha Ken Follett, Santiago?
Hola Javier, hola Ken, muchas gracias. Señor Follett, yo tengo una pregunta después de hacer una lectura sobre el libro. De acuerdo a lo que usted narra en Nunca, si bien es ficción, conlleva una gran carga de investigación. ¿Cabe suponer que una tercera guerra mundial está siendo vivida en estos momentos por nosotros, aunque no la hemos nominado como tal?
I just think it's possible, and I think we live in a very dangerous time because of that. And the novel shows how it could happen even though we don't want it to, and even if we have good leaders who try to prevent it, it could still happen. And I don't really believe in books with messages. I wrote this book because I thought it was a great story, but you can also see, I hope, from this novel, how easy it would be for the world to slip into a war accidentally.
De Colombia a Uruguay, donde hay una amplia colonia. Decía, hola, muchas gracias, Santiago, hasta otra. Vamos a Uruguay, un poco más al sur, con Agustina Balea, que por cierto tiene apellido gallego, no sé si tendrá raíces gallegas, pero Balea es un apellido muy, muy gallego. Siempre que hablamos con Uruguay, a mí me viene el Mundial del 50, Obdulio Varela, Schiaffino, pero no vamos a hablar de fútbol, vamos a hablar de literatura. Agustina Balea, te escucha Ken Follett.
Hola, buenas tardes, ¿cómo están? Yo tengo profesor, entonces me gustan muchísimo y de hecho he usado parte de su novela en mi
no se escucha. ¿Hay algún problema? Por lo menos a mí me llega, me parece que a Ken le está pasando lo mismo, no es posible traducir. Agustina, vamos a intentar recuperarlo más adelante, vamos a ver si podemos recuperar el sonido que tiene problemas. De Uruguay, por lo tanto, saltamos a Chile con Alberto Rojas. Vamos a ver si ahora hay suerte y podemos conectar y escuchar perfectamente a Alberto. Alberto, buenas tardes, noches desde España. Adelante.
Hola, ¿qué tal? Muy buenas tardes.
Se te escucha perfectamente. ¿Puedes formular la pregunta o dialogar con Ken?
Estupendo, muchas gracias. Señor Follett, la mayoría de sus novelas están ambientadas o se desarrollan en países de Europa y en Estados Unidos. ¿Ha considerado escribir alguna novela ambientada en América Latina? ¿Hay algún tema, momento histórico o personajes de esta región que le interesarían abordar? Muchas gracias.
Well, I have an open mind about this. It doesn't depend on the region, it depends on the story. If I think of a great story that takes place in Latin America, I will write it. As you see in Never, very little of the story takes place in Europe, even though I live in Europe. The story takes place in China and Africa and the United States. And the Europeans don't actually do much. So I'm very open-minded about this. I'll be very happy if I think of a great story. And I've read some great novels, many great novels set in Latin America. Of course, some of the greatest writers of our era are Latin American writers, and I read them in translation. Everything depends on the story. If I come up with a wonderful story set in Latin America, then I will write it. You bet.
Vamos a ver si seguimos teniendo suerte ahora con el sonido. De Chile nos vamos a Perú. Nos debe escuchar ahora José Antonio Atala Olaechea. José Antonio, ¿nos escuchas?
Sí, ¿qué tal? Muchas gracias. Señor Follett, es un placer conocerlo. Primero que nada, quería agradecerle por tantas horas de entretenimiento y aprendizaje. La verdad que leer sus obras es un placer. En cuanto a mi pregunta, bueno, quería ver que cuando usted escribió Los Pilares de la Tierra, ¿ya tenía proyectado que iba a ejecutar una trilogía o se le fue ocurriendo en el camino? ¿Cómo es el proceso preparatorio para desarrollar sus obras?
When I wrote The Pillars of the Earth, I had no idea that it would be a trilogy. In fact, I really didn't know that it would be the phenomenon that it became. I was hoping that it would be a bestseller, of course, and I was hoping that people would love it, but I had no idea how enormous the success of that book would be. And I certainly had no idea of writing a sequel. And that's partly because, that it was a difficult book to write. And when I finished it, I felt tired. I very rarely feel tired. My work doesn't make me feel tired. But it took me 3 years and 3 months to write The Pillars of the Earth. And when I finished it, I felt I didn't know if I could write anything else ever again. And if you had told me then that I needed to write a sequel to The Pillars of the Earth, I would have been horrified. I would have jumped in the river and drowned. But of course, time went by and people kept saying to me, when will you write another book like The Pillars of the Earth? And so in the end, of course, I did, because I'm a writer who likes to please the readers. That's what I'm all about. I have friends who say that they don't write for the reader, they write for themselves. But I'm not like that. I've always written for the reader. And so when people ask me to write a sequel, I thought about it for a long time, but in the end, I did. And my process is always, it begins with an idea. On day one, I might write 3 paragraphs saying what this story is about. And on day 2, I'll go over it again. It'll be 1 page. Day 3, it's 2 pages, and it grows like that. And what I do is I ask myself questions. There's a basic idea, like in Never, a crisis, a global crisis that leads to the edge of World War III. And then I say, okay, what happened before? Who are these people? What's their background? What do they want? These characters, what are their hopes? What are their fears? And I ask myself all these questions, and it grows. And it goes from 2 pages to 10 pages. And I end up with about 50 pages, which summarize the story. That's my process. And I started to work this way back with Eye of the Needle. And it's worked pretty well for me, and I've developed it over the years, but I still basically use that process.
Muchas gracias.
Gracias, José Antonio. De Chile saltamos el charco, el océano, volvemos de vuelta a Europa, a España. Yago Sparks, te escucha Ken Follett.
Digo que no estoy. Hola, señor Follett. Bueno, lo primero, gracias por este libro y por todos los que nos has regalado a lo largo de estos años. Estoy muy nervioso y sin creerme aún que pueda hablar con usted unos segundos. Y bueno, mi pregunta es que, bueno, como todos sabemos, la trilogía de Century abarca todo el siglo XX y yo quería saber si usted considera que hay algún otro siglo a lo largo de nuestra historia que sea susceptible de ocupar otra trilogía u otra saga a la manera como lo ha hecho con esta trilogía de Century que tengo aquí detrás. Y nada más.
Yes, I think there probably is. The 15th century in England was the time of the Wars of the Roses, and that would be a wonderful time to write about. But I can't because it's already been done. There's a TV show called Game of Thrones. I guess you probably have the same show in Spain. It's a big hit. And it's based on the 15th century, excuse me. It's based on the 15th century in England, although, of course, there's a lot of magic and supernatural events and so on. But really, I couldn't write a trilogy about the Wars of the Roses, as we call them here, because it's already been done. People would say, oh, he's just copying Game of Thrones. So it's difficult to think. But I guess any century that the writer loved, the writer could make a big trilogy out of it. You know, if you love it, if you're really into it, then I guess you could do it. You know, you could probably do it with any century in history. Everything depends on your engagement with it. You know, if it's fascinating, if the quarrels are interesting, if there are stories of hatred and revenge and passionate love in that century, then you can make something great out of it.
Sin duda. Muchísimas gracias.
Yago, muchísimas gracias a ti, Yago. ¿Estás en una librería? ¿Es tu casa? ¿Eso es tu biblioteca?
Es mi casa, es mi biblioteca, sí.
Tienes una muy buena biblioteca, ¿eh? Enhorabuena, hay que cuidarlas.
Soy gallego, que tú eres gallego y soy gallego también como tú.
Es lo que hay, es lo que hay. Por eso me han llamado, por ser gallego, yo creo. Y que tenemos mucha conexión con los británicos, o eso dicen. El mismo sentido del humor. Bueno, y otro día hablaremos de los Tudor y de los Lancaster, o aquí traducido a España, los Trastamara. Pero eso lo dejamos para más adelante. Vamos ahora a Argentina de nuevo, con María Florencia Peschetto, creo que se pronuncia así, de ascendencia italiana en este caso. Esta novela refleja unos roles muy distintos en el mundo femenino. Déjame adivinar, María, pero creo que tu pregunta va por ahí, ¿no?
Muy buenas tardes, muy buenas noches. Señor Follett, es un gusto enorme estar aquí con usted, escuchándolo y, bueno, sobre todo, leer sus libros. Mi pregunta, ¿sí?, tiene que ver con las mujeres, tanto en Nunca como en sus novelas anteriores, en la trilogía Century, en Los Pilares de la Tierra. Las mujeres, sí, son personajes fundamentales en sus libros. Son mujeres fuertes, son mujeres con mucho potencial. Entonces, mi pregunta tiene que ver con esto. ¿Qué considera o cómo considera cuál es el rol, sí, de la mujer en la política y en la actualidad? Y bueno, y esta pregunta, hacerle en qué mujeres usted se inspira para crear estos personajes.
Well, I'll answer the last part of the question first. The women in my stories are usually very smart, brave, and sexy. And I write women like that because I like women like that. And in fact, I'm married to a woman like that. And she is really the inspiration for a lot of the women in my stories. Why do I have strong women in my stories? You know, I was a student in London in the late 60s at the time that is now called the second wave of feminism. And here's the thing. The women who were saying, we are treated unfairly, we should have equal pay, we should be equal with men, they were the girls we liked. You know, we loved those girls. We dated them. Sometimes we went to bed with them, and sometimes we married them. But it was the girls we liked were saying this, so we listened. Of course, we listened. Now, for my father could never accept that women were equal, but it's a generation thing. You know, he was too old to change. I was 19. Of course I could change. Of course I could listen to this. And it made sense to all of us, not just me. It made sense to all of us who were, adolescents and students at that time. What the women were saying, it was true. Of course it was true. I remember somebody saying, we were very into politics in the 60s in universities, and we believed in democracy. Everything had to be, we were all equal. Everybody should have a vote. And I remember somebody saying, a girl saying, if we're all equal, why is it always the women who make the tea? And I remember thinking, yes, isn't that weird? Why don't we make our own tea? We men. You know, in those days, a man would never make tea for a woman, and the women always made. And I thought, I've never noticed that. How come I never saw? So this was like a big revelation to all of us, and we all agreed with these women. We loved these women. They were right, and they were politically right, and they fought their cause. They were treated horribly by the newspapers. There was a lot of crap about how these women were too masculine, and you know the kind of thing that those newspapers used to say. And so for me, it was natural that a woman should play a big role in a story. Why not? And also, of course, it's more interesting if there are both women and men in the story. It's it makes the story better. It's natural and it's a better story. So my first success was Eye of the Needle, which ends with a combat on a lonely island between two people. And normally in a thriller, that would be two men. I made it a man and a woman. And the woman had a child with her, and it made the book so much better. I did it because it was natural, but it was really, I didn't know it was clever, but it was. Do you know what I mean? Because women loved the story, and it was a better story. And I've always done that. I've always put women in strong positions. It's the way. That's the world I live in. Women are. The boss of my Spanish publishers is a woman. What can I tell you? Of course, my stories are full of strong and determined and smart women, because that's the way the world is.
Muchas gracias y lo felicito porque las mujeres protagonistas en este libro realmente valen la pena. Muchas gracias.
Gracias a ti. Hombre, en este libro una de las protagonistas es presidenta de Estados Unidos, que no es poca cosa. Y en la novela a la que hacía referencia, El ojo de la aguja o La isla de las tormentas, el duelo final entre un hombre y una mujer, entre un chico y una chica, lo gana la chica. Con lo cual, digamos, ahí tenemos ya una pista un poco por donde pueden ir las cosas. Vamos a Estados Unidos, que en Estados Unidos también se habla y mucho español, por fortuna. Liliana Garza, leía mal. ¿Nos escuchas ya desde Estados Unidos?
Sí, los escucho, Liliana Garza. Un honor. conocer al señor Follett. Mi pregunta es, ¿considera una ventaja haber trabajado como periodista en el proceso de documentación de sus novelas? ¿Y nos puede contar alguna anécdota sobre este proceso en esta novela? Gracias.
Being a journalist was both good and bad. It was good because I was writing every day for 5 years, and that made me a much more fluent writer. It was bad because I learned to write in the newspaper style, which is not suitable for a novel. And so I had to unlearn the newspaper style and develop a new style for a novel. And that was difficult, and it took me some years. I'll tell you one story about, I guess it's about research, because while I was a journalist, I had to take a train to a city called Peterborough. And I did the interviews, and then I had to take a train back to London, and I had to wait an hour for the train. So I went and looked at the cathedral. And it was the first time that I had really looked at a cathedral. Now, Peterborough Cathedral has a wonderful west entrance. It has 3 enormous arches. They look like doorways for giants to go through. And I was very struck by this wonderful building. And it was the beginning of my romance with medieval cathedrals. And it didn't happen instantly, but over time I became more and more interested in cathedrals, in the people who built them, in the society that produced them, and also in how they were built. You know, when you stand in front of one of those medieval cathedrals, you think, first of all, why did they build this? And secondly, how did they build this? And those are the 2 questions that form the basis of The Pillars of the Earth, which turned out to be my most popular book.
Muy bien, muchas gracias. Gracias.
Gracias. Pues vamos a concluir. De Estados Unidos de Norteamérica pasamos a una nación hermana, los Estados Unidos de México. Siempre echó una mano a España cuando fue necesario en el desgarrador siglo XX que vivimos. Allí nos escucha Valentina Traba para hacer formular la última pregunta a Ken Follett. Adelante.
Buenas tardes, Xavier. Buenas tardes, señor Follett. Un verdadero honor estar con usted el día de hoy. Mi pregunta es la siguiente. ¿Es usted un escritor que con la misma efectividad transporta al lector a un siglo o a otro siglo, pero también lo mantiene al borde de la silla, en constante emoción? ¿Cuál es el género que usted disfruta más escribir y por qué?
Well, you know, there isn't a preferred genre. I love thrillers and spy stories, and I love historical novels. And I guess, you know, if I had a really good idea for a science fiction novel, maybe I would write that. It's really not the genre for me. It's the strength of the story. If I think I can write a story that readers will have an emotional reaction, that will move them, that will make them cry or feel scared or feel angry, then that's the story that I'm going to write, no matter what the genre is. And of course, we classify writers all the time because we try to simplify everything, don't we? It's a human instinct, simplify everything. But in fact, as far as I'm concerned, the genre doesn't count for much. It's the strength of the story itself. Will people love this story? Will they remember it for a long time? These are the questions I ask. And I'm happy to write in any genre in which I think I can really move the hearts of my readers.
No tenga la menor duda de que lo logra. Muchísimas gracias.
Gracias, Valentina. Vamos concluyendo. Nos dejábamos antes una pregunta en el tintero, como se dice en España. Desde Uruguay, Agustina Balea no pudo entrar, había problemas de sonido. Yo le voy a formular, señor Follett, la pregunta que ella tenía preparada o la idea que ella tenía preparada para concluir ya esta conexión virtual. Ella es profesora de historia y pregunta: ¿cómo hace para planear sus novelas históricas? primero surge la historia y luego la ubica en determinado tiempo histórico, le sucede al revés o aparece todo junto.
With the historical novels, I think of a time in history where the actions of individuals could change the course of history. Sometimes history seems to move like the sea. You can't stop it. And sometimes there seem to be moments in history where one person or a few people could change everything. And I look for moments when a few people could change everything. That's what excites me. So when I've thought of that, then I think, okay, how will I tell this story? Where will it take place? And quite often, it strikes me that some of this story could take place in Kingsbridge. Kingsbridge has come to stand for England in my work. You know, something happens to England like the Black Death or the wars of religion, and I think, well, I'll tell this story in Kingsbridge because Kingsbridge had the Black Death. Kingsbridge suffered from the persecution of the time of the Reformation, and my readers like Kingsbridge. So if I have a good idea, I might try and set it in Kingsbridge. But really the idea comes first, that moment when individuals can change history. That's the important thing.
Bueno, pues esta es la última pregunta. Ha sido, llevamos casi una hora conversando y se nos hace corto. Ha sido un placer, un honor y bueno, nunca olvidaremos los que hemos entrado aquí este día de 18, día 18 en el que vamos a recordar noviembre, que hablamos durante una hora con Ken Follett. Nadie lo hubiera podido predecir para ninguno de nosotros. Mi apellido es Fortes, el suyo es Follett, algo debemos tener en común, pero seguramente el talento quedó en el Reino Unido. Señor Follett, ha sido un placer, un honor. Ya hemos conversado unas cuantas veces en televisión española cuando nos ha visitado y para mí ha sido un orgullo y un honor poder estar con usted conversando y hablando de literatura, de historia y de política. Desde España, todo el abrazo del mundo, todo el reconocimiento y muy buenas noches.
Thank you. It's always a pleasure to talk to you, Xabier, and thanks to all of the people who joined for your questions. I've enjoyed talking to you very much, and I hope we can do it again sometime. Good night, everybody.
Buenas noches, buenas noches.
When I was doing the research for Fall of Giants, I was shocked to realise that the First World War was a war that nobody wanted. No European leader on either side meant it to happen. Even the arrogant old Emperor of Austria who started it only really wanted a little local conflict with Serbia, a sort of punishment raid for the assassination of his nephew. But one by one, the emperors and prime ministers, without intending war, made decisions, logical, moderate decisions, each of which took us a small step closer to the most terrible conflict the world had ever known. The misery of the trenches, the horror of poison gas, a war in which 6,000 soldiers died every day for 4 years. A war which I came to believe was fought by mistake. The awful thought that occurred to me was, could that happen again? And I asked myself the question that is the beginning of every one of my novels. Could I write a story about that? How would it start? In my story, what would be our equivalent of the assassination that ignited World War I? I interviewed people involved in decision-making at the highest level and asked them what did they see as the flashpoints of today, the modern equivalents of Serbia or Alsace-Lorraine.
Kim Darroch was National Security Advisor to Prime Minister David Cameron and later British Ambassador in Washington. He's now Lord Darroch. My story involves connections between terrorism and organized crime, and you feel that's important.
A fascinating aspect to the story you are telling, because it took me back to my National Security Advisor days and what we used to hear about the connections between organized crime and terrorism, and particularly organized crime and people trafficking. Combine this with thinking about where do terrorists get their money from? Because it's quite an expensive business. Buying weapons, looking after yourself between your terrorist outrages or whatever wars you are fighting. I mean, it's not a very big step from, I promise you, from someone who does people trafficking to someone who works for or is part of ISIS. That connection is very, very close. Sometimes they're one and the same thing.
Baroness Catherine Ashton was for 5 years the European High Representative responsible for foreign affairs, effectively the foreign minister of the European Union. And she's a friend of mine, and she has read the first draft of Never and given me extensive notes. You've read my chapter in Never, in which a stolen American drone is used to bomb an African city. Can you tell me how you would picture the president and his or her cabinet reacting to that?
So all events that happen of significance across the world are monitored 24 hours a day, 365 days of the year in the Situation Room. Once the drone attack has happened, then of course the information that this was a stolen American drone will have been of huge significance. And so the president would convene a meeting in the basement of the White House in the Situation Room, where already gathered would have been the military staff and the national security team led by the National Security Advisor, who would be looking at the information and the evidence, and particularly in the context of the book, will have been very concerned about what the Chinese would have thought happened. And information would have gone directly to Beijing as swiftly as possible to explain this was not US action. Because these incidents, as the book so brilliantly shows, so quickly turn and change and move forward in ways that you cannot predict.
I studied the ways in which civilization today is menaced by terrorism, by the remorseless expansion of the Sahara Desert, by the reckless ambitions of newly wealthy countries and the stubborn determination of declining powers to hold on to what they've got. There's no shortage of dangerous situations. I thought of the great powers of today and asked, would our leaders be any better than those of 1914 at avoiding war, at finding peaceful solutions to quarrels between countries? I talked to people about how diplomacy may defuse a conflict and how pride and aggression can make a problem into a crisis. And I began to see the shape of my novel. It's a story that moves from the West Wing of the White House to the Sahara Desert, and from there to Beijing. I imagined a small group of smart, dedicated, tough-minded characters struggling to prevent the outbreak of a terrible war. A young American woman working for the CIA in North Africa, a Chinese spy master married to a glamorous TV star, a handsome French secret agent, a woman president of the United States. When I started writing, I didn't know how it would end, and you won't know until the very last page. The book is called Never. I hope you enjoy it, and I hope it never happens.